What's up everybody, and welcome back to another video in our book tracking app course, which is part of our Kotlin Android starter course. So basically we're just going through a bunch of different Jetpack libraries, and we just got done with our Room database, and now we're going to be looking at some issues that we created in the last video and how we can fix them. But before we do that, if you don't have the code for this video, if you look down in the description below, you can go ahead and grab it from there. Or if you've been following along, you should already have it loaded into your Android Studio and ready to go. So basically, the problem that we're running into is if I come into my application here and if I click a couple of these, which again, this check mark marks that finished field in our book class. So if I look in here, I've got this finished field. So if I toggle a couple of those, and then I come here and let's turn my internet off. And now I rerun the app. They're still toggled, but if I turn my internet back on and restart my app again, you can see they get set back to just an X. So what's causing this? Basically, we've got two sources of data for our application. So if you look on over in our book tracker view model, and then you go up to your, here we go, in our get all books function, if our internet is working and we're connected, then we're going to pull in our data from our API, which is, of course, our REST interface, which is going to be that Firebase database that we built online in a previous video. And if our internet is off, then we're going to pull it from our books DAO, which is our database access object, which is what we built in the previous video. So we have two different places that we can pull data from. And on top of that, whenever I toggle one of these, I update that in my cache, but I'm not updating that in my Firebase database. So first, we need to make a decision here whether this book list that we're pulling from Firebase is going to be a shared list that we want everybody to share and be able to update the online database, or just an individual list on everybody's app. So basically, if it's only an individual list, then there shouldn't be any data coming from that list that I need to update ever on that Firebase list. Because if we're going to be sharing this across any different devices, then this finished field, we shouldn't be writing back to the database. If we want this list on the Firebase to be only for my account, then definitely we would want to update all of these finished updates. We would want to make that update in the cache in our database on our local app and in the Firebase database. But because we're going to be sharing that between multiple different people and multiple different phones, and also just for simplicity's sake in this video, I'm going to go ahead and say that we're not going to read in that data from that app. So to do that, I'm going to come on back over to my book. I'm going to come on to my finished, my val finished boolean, and this serialized name, I'm just simply going to delete that and leaving it with a equals to false. And this is going to be our default value. And because I delete the serialized name, we're no longer going to read this field in from our Firebase database. So if I restart my app now, you can see they're all set to unfinished. So if I check a couple of those and run it again, they're all set to not finished again. Now, if I run this, if I check a couple, it's going to save it in my cache. So now, still, if I disconnect from the internet and rerun my app, it's going to pretty much give me that, it'll save these. But if I'm connected to the internet, it's going to overwrite it. And that's because we're getting a default false from there every single time. So we'll basically have to go in and update that. But second, we're going to need to change it so that we're only pulling data from a single source. So in Kotlin and in app design, what they call this is a single source of truth, which is essentially a design principle that says my app's data, and especially the data being displayed, should really only at all times be coming from one single place. So right now, I'm pulling from sometimes my local cache, which is the room database, and then sometimes from the Firebase, and even at other times, right, if I just have a local state that's updating my UI. So we don't want to do that. We always want to be pulling all of our data from just one single source of truth, which in this case, we are going to turn into we're going to turn our database, our room database, into our single source of truth. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds here, I'm actually going to come over into my Gradle file, and from time to time, obviously updates are put out, and you can see a bunch of these are outdated. So I'm going to go ahead and update all of these just because I tend to like to use the most recent stable version. So this compose UI version is actually within our project build.gradle file. And it's going to be right here. So we're going to change that from 1.4.2 to 1.4.3 and then hit sync now. And then if I come back to my other Gradle file, okay, so now you'll see that most of our warnings went away, but I missed one. So we'll change that one too. And there we go. Now everything is up to sync and we're using the latest stable version on everything. So I'm going to close out of the build.gradles. We won't need those again for a while. And then this book tracker view model. First, I'm going to start by renaming that. So if you look over in our project window, we have our book details screen and then our book details view model. And then we have a book screen and then a book tracker view model. But really this book tracker view model goes to this book screen. So actually what I'm going to do here, I'm going to follow this scheme here where it says book details screen and then book details view model. So I'm going to change my book screen, refactor, rename, and my book screen is now going to be books screen. And we're going to refactor that one. And then inside of books screen, my top function, I'm also going to refactor that as well, rename, and that one is going to be books screen as well. And then my book tracker view model, I'm also going to refactor that guy. So right click, refactor, rename, and this is now going to be books view model. And that's just, so now we have books screen and books view model, and then we have book details screen and book details view model. So that's just a little more consistent. But that's not anything functional at all. Let's get into some of the functional changes we have to make. So now in this books view model, come down to the bottom, and I'm going to add a new function in here. And this is going to be called refresh cache is what I'll put it right, maybe right under get all books. We're going to call this refresh cache. So private suspend function refresh cache. Now within this function, we're just going to say val remote books equals API dot get books. So we're going to pull in, we're going to make our network call, and then we're going to say books DAO dot add all, and I'm going to add my remote books into my database. So this is refreshing my database with all the information from my network call. So once we have that done, let's go up to our get all books function. And in here, we can get rid of all of that. And we just need to say refresh cache now. And then in the catch block down below, instead of returning down here, we're just going to throw exception error no data to display. And then after all of this, down here, I'm going to put in return with contexts books DAO dot get all. Okay, so now we're going to try to refresh our cache, which is going to pull data in from our network call and then save it into our database. And then after that, if there's an exception, we're going to throw that exception so it doesn't crash our program, and we're going to give it that error message. And then after that, we're going to return every time books.dao.getAll. So we're always getting all of our data for this book list here. We're always going to be pulling that in from our DAO or from our room database. Now let's go up to our getBooks function. And here we've got another problem. We've got valBooks equals getAllBooks, so that's fine. We want that. And then we've got state.value equals books.restore finished fields. Well, this restore finished field, we're not really going to be using that anymore. So I'm going to remove that there. And then also, I'm just going to get rid of that from down here. And now let's go down and look at our toggle finished function. So here in the toggle finished function, essentially what we have is we're reading in our data for our books from our state value instead of from our database. But if we want our application to follow the single source of truth best practices, then we definitely want to be reading that always in from the database. So to do that, in the toggle finished DB, just down here, I'm going to add this line and I'm going to say books.dao.getAll. Now up within this toggled finish function, I'm going to get rid of this state.value equals books. We're not going to want to do that from the state anymore. We're going to then expand this coroutine launch. And within here, I'm going to say state.value equals, and we're going to need to set this equal to the value coming back from here. So val updated books equals toggle finish db, and we can do that because the last line here, books.dao.getAll, is going to be returning that. So the state value equals updated books. So essentially now we're going to be reading, or we're setting our state based on our updated books instead of vice versa. So this is going to fix that problem, but there's just one more problem that we're going to need to look at, and basically we're using that replace strategy in our books DAO. So here on conflict strategy replace, and because in our book we removed the serialized name from the finished tab, and this has a default of false, that means every time we read in from our database, it's going to read in a false for the finished value, which means anytime we're online, all of these are going to get reset to false, and that's obviously not what we want. So we need a way to track that and restore them all. So what I'm going to do in this refresh cache function, we're basically going to add a line in here to get all of the finished books before we actually add all the new ones. So in here, I'm going to say val finished books equals books DAO dot get all finished. And obviously this is going to be red because I haven't actually made that function yet. We're going to go make that in a second. And then books add all. And then after we've added them all into the database, books DAO update all. So within here, I'm going to say finished books dot map. And then within that map, I'm going to do partial book finished, and we're going to map it.id, so it being the book, it.id to true. So what this is going to do is it's going to put that true value back on the finished field because of our partial book finished. So what we need to do now is go ahead and implement these two functions. Go on over to your books DAO, and we need to add functions for both of those. So at update, and our entity is going to be equal to our book class, of course. And then suspend function update all. And this is going to take a partial book, which is actually going to be a list of partial book objects in here. So I'm going to name that to partial books. And then one more function that we'll need in here, we need at query. And basically we have to give it what SQL query we want to put in here. So what we know we want this function to do, we want suspend fun get all finished, and this is going to return a list of types book. So in SQL, the way that you do that is you select asterisk, which asterisk is a wildcard for everything. So select everything from books, and again, books is our table name here. So we're going to select everything from books where the value of our finished is equal to 1. So in Kotlin, for a Boolean variable, it's either true or false, but in SQL, it's either 0 or 1. So where 1 is essentially, that's the equivalent of in Kotlin saying equal to true. So now that we have that, you can come back over to our book model and you can see that our refresh cache is actually working there. So now let's run that code. And you can see here War and Peace and then Moby Dick and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Let me just mark a couple of these. A Christmas Carol, A Tale of Two Cities. And now when it comes back up, you can see A Christmas Carol and then A Tale of Two Cities are both still marked. And just to really prove it, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Hobbit. So everything on here is marked now. We'll run that one more time. And everything on here is still marked until I scroll down, obviously, and it's all unmarked again. But so our cache is working now here, but we still have one problem. So if I click on like the two towers, for example, you'll see that I'm getting an X again, meaning it's not finished. So we're going to want to do something to get that to update as well. Now the reason for that is we've been talking a lot about single source of truth, and we fixed our books view model. So now that is only using one single source of truth, which is going to be our local cache database. But if we switch over here to our book details view model, which is what this is pulling from, and you look at the get book, we're actually still pulling from our, not from our database, only from our network call. So we're going to want to refactor all of this too. But to do that, because here we're just doing a network call for a single book, we're going to need to have a database update and a database pull function for a single book as well. So go on back over to your book DAO. We're going to add two more functions in here. The first one is going to be at query, and then this query is just going to be select all from books where our ID equals, and then you say colon ID, and that colon ID is a variable that we're going to pass in. It's a parameter we're going to pass into that function. So suspend fun get book ID colon, and that's going to be an int, and then that's going to pass back a book. So that'll get us a single book. But now if we want to update a single book as well, we need another function. So at insert on conflict, and I'm going to set that equal to on conflict strategy dot replace, just like we did above. And then down here, we're going to say suspend fun add, and then book of type book. Okay, that should be everything that we need in the DAO. So come on back over to your book details view model. And here we need to add a reference to that DAO. So I could type it all out again here, but I'm just going to copy it from my book view model. So copy this DAO line and come back over to your book details. And then we have private var books DAO equals books.database or books.db.getDAO instance, and then pass it your application context. And now that we have a reference to our DAO, let's create a refresh cache function in here as well. So private suspend fun, refresh cache, and this is just going to take the ID of the book. And then within here, let's say val remote book equals get remote book ID. So this is going to get our remote book based on the ID from our Firebase database. And then after that, we're going to say val book finished equals books DAO dot get book ID dot finished. So basically what we're doing here is we're storing our new book from our data or from our Firebase, from our remote server in our remote book variable. And then here is the book finished. Well, that's the selection that I had set on my previous book finished before we overwrite it with the new book that we pulled down from the network. Now I'm going to say books DAO dot add, and we're going to add the remote book, the one that we pulled down from the network. And then after that, we could say if book finished. So if it was true before, then we're going to want to update that as well. So we could say val partial book equals partial book finished. And in here, we're just going to need our ID and true. Or if you, we could do true, or we could do book finished. Either of those would work fine. But I'm just going to leave that as true for now. Okay, and then after we've got this partial book, we need to add that to our database, or not add it, rather, we need to update that in our database. And we can say books DAO.update partial book. And then after that, we just simply need to call this refresh cache function. So come down here to your get book, and then inside here where we're calling the coroutine, we're going to get rid of this val book equals get remote book, and we're just going to say refresh cache and pass it your ID. And now our state.value is no longer, we don't want to pull it from book anymore. We want to pull it from books DAO.get book ID. So now everything on both our book details view model screen and then our books view model screen as well, that's all coming from our local cache, which is our room database. So we shouldn't see any of those issues popping up anymore. So let's go ahead and restart this and just note that was the 2 towers. And now you have the 2 towers still selected here. If I click on that, it's going to still be selected here as well. And actually one more thing we're going to want to update here. So if you come inside of your get book, this refresh cache, just like here, we have that wrapped in a try catch block. And here actually I'm going to change this a little bit. So log.e. In here, we're just going to say books view model, and I'm going to copy this data up here. Error, no data to display. Put that inside of your log.e. And instead of throwing that, we want to actually return with context. So we'll return that there. And then let's go ahead and just copy that try catch block. Come on back over to book details view model. And instead of refresh cache, we're going to do all of that. Refresh cache ID, pass it our ID value. And then instead of return with value, we're just going to do state.value equals, or instead of return with context, we do state.value equals booksDAO.getBook ID. And now we should be good to go. So let's go ahead and take this into offline mode. So now we're not connected to the internet. We're offline. Run this one more time. You can see here's our list. And if I click on the Hobbit, it still shows up there. And it's just pulling everything there from the cache. So now we have our entire application, both our details screen and our book list screen as well. It's all using just that room database cache for the single source of truth. which means that if for whatever reason the system initiated death occurred, it doesn't really matter because we're going to restore it all from our local cache in the database. So you can come on over to the books view model, and this private val state handle, you can see it's grayed out. That's because we don't really need that variable anymore. That was there because we were using it to restore our finished fields when we were storing that in the state. But because we have that in the local cache now, we don't need to worry about that. Hopefully you guys found this video helpful and learned something along the way. If you need any of the final code or even the beginner code, again, you can get that down in the description below. If this video was helpful for you, definitely like it and then subscribe to our channel, and we will see you all in the next video.